Hello, Wednesday, 8 o'clock is us. We're DebateSensei. We got Tim Seavey here from Resolutions and San Diego State University.
Woo!
Yeah.
How's it going?
I'm Jared Kabika-Miller, Professor of Communications and Debate Coach, and we are going to be talking about the National High School Policy Debate topic for 2020-2021. That's going to be annoying. That is going to be really annoying having to say that. Oh man, I hate that. Like 20, because you can't say 2021,
right?
You know what I mean? Because then they're kind of like
2021.
Yeah, you have to say both of them, and it's like you have to say 20 4 times in a row. Anyways, hey, here we go. All right, cool. United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the United States in one or more of the following: forensic science, policing, sentencing. Tim, you like it?
I'm a fan. I think that this is a pretty cool, timely topic.
All right. Well, yeah, I do agree. Very timely. I think that the 3 parts, I think we ought to just go in that order. And there should be a section where we talk about overall stuff. You want to do that first or last?
Let's talk about like overall stuff first. I mean, we can probably get into some of the specifics as that goes. So how do you generally approach a topic? I know last week we talked about the upcoming LD topic. So that's also a year-long topic for the collegiate level. So I've got an idea from that. How is it that you approach a subject like this where there's already like a couple specific parts as options? Like what's your initial research?
What I did this time, which isn't exactly how I always do it, but what I did this time is I went to my library and looked up the database that they got, and they do have like a criminal justice journal. And I was kind of, going through and just looking at the headlines and seeing what they're talking about. And from the headlines, I wasn't all too impressed. They wanted to talk about like porch pirates on one of them, but there was other things about like depolicing that I think are helpful as far as like overall research topics. And that one might be more of a negative approach, but knowing that type of argument. So I was just going like, I like to kind of keep it broad, and I try to look at a bunch of different things and try to start seeing patterns in like those different publications that you see. So like when you go to a publication and it's called like, criminal justice review, I just start looking at what have they been talking about for the last 2 or 3 years.
Sure. Okay, cool. Yeah, I tend to try and find whatever the like blandest possible data source is. So it's the news equivalent of C-SPAN, but just trying to find like, all right, where can I get as unbiased of reporting of just straight data as possible? Because if you start Googling like just what should change about the criminal justice system, there's going to be a million news articles that all have their own slant, right? So, and that I find pretty immediately and easily starts changing what you start looking for, and also just the way that search algorithms work as they start feeding you more of what you're already looking at. So I prefer just going for the really bland stuff. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics seemed to be like pretty straightforward, like the most meaty data that I could find on it. But it seems like one of the things off the bat that's going to be difficult is the difference between federal, state, and local prisons. So there seems to be pretty dramatic differences in some of the stats that I'm seeing in like incarceration rates and recidivism rates, and even just like the individuals like arrested in each particular area, which is to be expected, right? Like federal prisons tend to be more serious crimes, county prisons tend to be lower, right? But even at that level, I think that students are really going to have to grapple with that, because they may come across issues that are really bad that are localized to one particular area that maybe the federal government doesn't have jurisdiction over. Or at the, another way, they may just be focusing on federal, but there's all kinds of issues that are going on at the state level that need to be addressed that similarly maybe federal policy can't sway. So I think it's important when looking at statistics to see which group of incarcerated persons you're looking at, or which group of policing actions or forensic evidence, whatever. There's multiple tiers to criminal justice, so finding which one your stats are related to, I think, is a key first piece not to miss.
Yeah, because I mean, the easiest approach is usually just to do any sort of federal prison system or federal,
Sure.
police force, and so if you just focus on those particular crimes in prisons and justice systems, then you kind of avoid all of that particular difficulty. Then again, there are ways to kind of break through that log jam. You know what I mean? That there is a responsibility for sort of a minimum set of protections for all citizens, regardless of what state you're in. Yeah, and so if you're willing to have that discussion, I think that you could tackle that. You really could.
Sure. So let's look at some of the specifics then. I have to admit, I didn't research super deeply into forensics evidence, but I didn't come up with a lot of right.
Yeah.
Like, so
into that. I'll leave this part right here. Okay.
Yeah, I want to hear.
So listen, there's fairly recently, so in academic terms, it's fairly recent, like within the last 10 years, I think that there's been a whole lot of literature published about the sort of inaccuracies and unreliability of forensic science, things that they consider to be like evidence in a courtroom, and it's really not as reliable as they say. So like let's do a cultural sort of touch point. Dexter, he's a blood spatter analyst, right? You know what I mean? He goes in and looks at blood spatters and gives them the way that he does it, it's like he can like deconstruct the entire crime scene based off of the blood spatters, and it is nothing like that. It is nowhere near that reliable. You know what I mean? Like, and so they've been doing like sort of like with the rise of statistics and that sort of field of study sort of applying to a bunch of different places. When they start doing statistical analysis of these forensic sciences, they're not seeing very good results. Blood spatter is like one example of that. I think that you could, like, if you really want to get technical, there might be some debaters that get really technical and they hone in on one or more of these particular types of forensic sciences. And like some of them have like 90% false positives. You know what I mean? Just ridiculous. Like that was the hair analysis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So like everyone thinks that hair analysis is like this sort of lock, throw them in the prison sort of level of evidence. And really the only thing it's good at is comparing what hair it's not like. Comparing what it's like doesn't help a whole hell of a lot. You know what I mean? It's like, and there's a whole bunch of false positives. There's no way to tell, it like sometimes whether it's human or animal, and so
okay.
And so there's a lot of inaccuracies in those things.
So I think what is going to be important this year that may not have been as important in previous years is significance as a stock issue. I feel like that one's pretty regularly glossed over, like when you get like harms, inherency, solvency, etc. But I think when you're talking about topicality, but when you're talking about significance, I think it's easy to maybe pick out something that seems like, this is, no brainer, this should be fixed. But I think an argument could be one that like, that can be fixed. But the criminal justice system as a whole has so many, truly significant problems, like inherent systemic problems that need to be fixed, that are like, tremendous human rights abuses, that it may not be significant enough to go for something that's like a forensic science thing. I think you're going to have to in some cases like compare, how many cases per year or something like that, or like how many false positives, whatever. So just to see how prevalent something is, because there's obviously some pretty big glaring ones when you're talking about criminal justice as a whole.
Right. I absolutely. I think if anyone who approaches this topic trying to do this like sort of colorblind policy, I think you're opening yourself up to some really bad critique. Stuff. Like I'd go with that over a significance T, honestly.
Oh, that's your point.
You know what I mean? I think that's, I don't know, just a little bit more genuine, and you probably got. And so if you're choosing something like bullet metallurgy affirmative. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
like
Is that really what we need to be talking about here?
Hey man, like bust out that K on that stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Like I'm
Yeah.
not I would not. There's just like some interesting little tidbits here and there about what forensic science is and some examples of it. You know.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So on, I mean, if nothing else, maybe it's worthwhile just reading up so you've got some good diss ads to add on to, whatever argument you have against it, but probably not the best tree to bark up for your actual affirmative case. So
Yeah.
on the policing side of things, this one seems to be tougher, at least in my research, just because there are absolutely, examples and plenty of evidence around the militarization of the police, right? So like treating it as a branch of military, not as a mechanism of keeping the peace. Like keeping the peace
problem. It's like people have been talking about that forever. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like demilitarize the police has been a case for a long time.
Yeah. So I think that's going to be. I look forward to seeing how deep that one goes. And I think talk about extremely timely. When you get Black Lives Matter movement talking about like defund the police, and then some cities their response to that. So like San Francisco, for example, took just about all generally nonviolent responses that police officers typically take. So that's things like any like mental health related issues. So if like the police are called for like mental health related thing, or anything involving like a child's not like a child's safety, but if there's like the police are being called on a minor committing some nonviolent crime, or like there's a list of a few things. I can link the article here.
Yeah.
They have an entirely separate group of people that they're sending out that are unarmed. So just as an alternative.
That you wrote, is this one of those or no? Okay.
No. That's actually not one that's linked there. I'll link that in just a second. So it's functionally establishing a group of like peacekeepers. Probably, unfortunately, that name has gotten really raked through the mud with like the UN and whatnot. But it's a different group of law enforcement personnel that are more social workers than police. So they're not out there to arrest. They're actually trained for all the other things. And I think there's an argument to be made about like we currently put everything that doesn't fit into a round hole on the police, right? Like the fire department is there for fires, like the ambulance is there for medical emergencies, and then everything else goes to the police. And what tools do the police have besides like arresting people as their primary hammer? And then like everything becomes a nail. So when you remove the policing element from it, so like removing, I think probably a pretty good case is removing the number of dispatcher responses to which police are sent. So that I think immediately takes out of the realm of possibility a huge number of potential arrests and a huge amount of incarceration and other like major problems, brutality and things that come from our militarized system of police. What about other things that you've seen?
So when I was like, I looked up defunding the police, and the weird thing is that there really isn't a whole lot of academic literature on that. I hope people prove me wrong. Operating off of the databases that are available through my particular college. Some other people have way more powerful databases. I would love to see some like more academic peer-reviewed level stuff on defunding the police. I also think it's been called something like a police abolition or something like that a little while ago, or at least the most common reference point to it. So that's one thing about defunding the police. The other thing is, as I'm typing in defunding the police, depolicing comes up, and this becomes like, I guess something that people ought to know about, because I'm not exactly where it fits into the debate, but it seems like it could be a disadvantage if you wanted to. Depolicing is the concept that, with all this sort of bad press and sort of, inspection and stuff like that, that the police reduce their like response to when they are actually needed, and that actually affects crime rates. And so I think, and so that does have a lot more literature on it, or at least, at least when I'm just kind of like tooling around looking for some stuff. I haven't gotten on a really deep dive yet. I haven't, what I mean? Depolicing is something you might want to be aware of.
That's worthwhile. So I think that's what this would count as. So it's an LA Times article that I just linked up. We can share as a resource. So it's that San Francisco police officers will be replaced with trained, unarmed professionals to respond to calls for help on non-criminal matters involving mental health, the homeless, school discipline, and neighbor disputes as part of new wave reforms. So like right there, that takes out a huge category of things that were otherwise occupying a huge amount of police time. Some of the arguments that I'm seeing also are that just a huge portion of the budget of police departments does not go to police officers, which is a reasonably problematic issue, right? Like whatever position you have, like people still value police officers individually. Like if you are in serious trouble, like you want the police to be able to help with something, right? But when it's saying like, okay, remove police from all these other areas, that's pretty straightforward. It's kind of like the argument of like military arguments, right? Like you've got a very kind of right heavy position of like you have to fund the military, have to fund the military. But when the majority, like vast majority of military dollars go to contractors to research stuff that may or may not ever actually be created, and then meanwhile soldiers are paid like minimum wage, right? Like we support the troops, but then also what I really mean by that is Raytheon. Like it's a totally different kind of discussion there. So I think a similar thing could be made for just like reorganizing the budget of police departments. So like that's a change in policing. I don't know. Do you think that gets into topicality grounds? Like, is that not quite, in line with resolution?
I mean, yeah, I think defunding defunding the police kind of covers that. You know what I mean? It's like moving the budget around internally. No, you gotta like if you're running a defund the police, that's a pretty good topic right there. You know what I mean? Like I think that's like really timely and it's like gets to the heart of it. And it totally it's a hardcore link on that one. I can't wait to see it because right now it's like you want to fire all of the. Oh God, The Onion has such a great article on defunding the police. Where it's
where officers are like fired, publicly humiliated, and forced to get a divorce or something.
Yeah. Therefore, yeah. Oh man, yeah. The Onion's pretty good stuff.
And one of the other on the side of policing, I know that there's a lot of literature just about the density of police officers in in any given space, right? So you're talking like Irvine, California has a significantly different density of police that are either walking the streets or just driving around than you're talking like downtown LA. Then you also start looking at like difference in demographics and so like stop and frisk policies were a very direct, like straightforward one in New York that was addressed, received a huge amount of heat, and then like policy went into changing that, right? So the major issue was that police officers were allowed to stop and frisk anyone that they so chose on the street, without anything besides their own gut feeling of probable cause. But the amount of racial bias that came into that was like, people of color that were stopped and frisked at dramatically higher rates than any other group. So like that was a policy that just kind of gave license to really like racially based policing. Similarly, just the density of police groups in an area. And I think it becomes a good argument, I think, to make this like messed up chicken and egg cycle where it's like, oh, well, the crime rate's so much higher there, so that's why the police have to be there. No, the crime rate is high because there's a significant density of police. It's like, the argument, if you put a police car behind anyone on the road and follow them for 40 miles, you're going to break a law, right? Like if someone is always behind you, like if the police is always on something. So the issue of over policing creates the issue of a greater crime rate that can then be exploited. The difference. So really good resource. One of the ones that I put that we can put up in the chat here is a link to a YouTube video of the author of The New Jim Crow. So Michelle, her name is Michelle. Oh, I had it here just a second ago. I believe it's Michelle Alexander. So she had a really, really brilliant talk that she gave through the U Chicago. And it was, Michelle Alexander. So Dr. Alexander worked for like the ACLU. She's a Stanford law professor, super, super into this area. So she wrote the book, The New Jim Crow, that does a really job of breaking down like historically and then modern, like what the detailed policy issues are that allow for really race-based or racially biased policing, sentencing, and like recidivism issues, right? So those come from pretty straightforward policies that, like in the era of slavery, like, okay, you can point at slavery, like this is the problem, or Jim Crow laws, like these are very straightforward the problem. But we have since changed that terminology, yet the social climate has not significantly changed. So it's just like the groups that are being oppressed are not necessarily just people of color, it's instead criminals, which just so happens to be, right, like the label that we give to groups that are way over policed and way over sentenced for issues. So on the policing front, any other like suggestions or kind of topic areas to go down on that one?
No. I had a few ideas on sentencing, and they're like oldies but goodies. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think sentencing.
I think that's probably one of the best ones to go for.
Oh yeah. Because I mean, like the mandatory minimums is just solid.
Oh, sure.
And it just continues to be a problem. And so the thing that so mandatory minimums, if you don't know, there are certain crimes that carry with the mandatory minimums, but the crimes that have certain higher mandatory minimums tend to be sort of influenced by the racial component, right? And so like certain types of drugs that tend to dominate in neighborhoods of color or something like that, they are that those crimes have higher mandatory minimums than things like, you know, highly refined cocaine. That and so and that leads to, you know, just well, I mean, like that in and of itself is, you know, a problem to solve.
Yeah, it's really straightforward. Like you can tell the story even in 10 seconds. It's like crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine. Like those are the same thing at you know, generally a chemical level, but the way that the mandatory minimum sentencing is applied to them is drastically different and tremendously racist. Like so that's creating, you know, huge issues. So one of the ones that I would say, so 450,000 people in the U.S. are incarcerated currently and on any given day for nonviolent drug offenses. So I think on the policing side of it, the probably boldest and one of the best arguments that I think could be made is just to completely remove criminal sentencing and or like any so remove any like criminal charges from drug related offenses. So right away that would take about a quarter to a third of the prison population, that's currently 2 million people in the US, would take that large portion and remove them from, you know, prisons, which is already a huge major issue. But when you're talking about sentencing, really the narrative that like struck me that I never really considered was, so in the days of Jim Crow, it was like, here are the laws that say, you know, African Americans are not allowed to do any of the following things, right? And it was just so straight and blatant and straightforward. Now it is, if you carry a felony or a criminal record, you cannot get, and that list is almost identical. So if you have a criminal record, you can't get a house. You are not going to be getting a job. Your ability to vote, your ability to serve on a jury, your ability to participate in like any democratic process, but also your ability, like, you know, education. Think like FAFSA, so student funding, right? Like if you want to get federal aid. So say you've committed a crime, even a nonviolent drug-related crime, but then you go to prison for however long that is, lose out on all of the life that you have now lost out on, as well as opportunities, go out like you've served your time now and try to reintegrate into society. And the odds are so heavily stacked against you, it's nearly impossible. So you're not even going to get, you know, federal funding to, you know, get student loans to go back to school for it. So at every level of advancement, even just like base human needs, they're now, you know, people with a criminal record are just completely excluded from that process. So that's where recidivism ends up becoming the major issue. So recidivism is the rate at which someone that was incarcerated will return to prison, and it's like 43% right now. So like you're about half and half likely, and it's even worse in some areas, and then the incarceration rates in big cities even worse. So I think that's like the most straightforward direct area that just is ripe for a good case.
Yeah. I think like the death penalty is also, you know what I mean? Like
right.
Hey man, like I'm surprised it's still a debate, but man, it is, and so might as well take advantage of that one too. A lot of the same arguments apply. It is, but it's the ultimate sentence, you know what I mean? And so
right,
start getting and Yeah, I think there's a lot of good evidence, and man, that one has been around forever. I remember that was like an old case when I started, and
Sure.
I'm
Yeah.
really surprised. Yeah,
So
yeah.
here's one that I know there's a lot of like good ground to talk about on the affirmative. Here's where it's going to get really difficult and tricky. How do you argue on the negative, right? Like you're going to be coming up against really probably well researched, well argued positions of like, yep, that's a major issue with criminal justice, and I agree. And also what? So like, what's the general negative strategy that you'd think of?
I gravitate towards a critique in general. I would definitely have one on color blindness, and I, I don't know. There would be a number of different sort of critical positions that you could take. I think that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about um, would be open to that as well. You know, I
Sure.
just I think that the time that we are in right now is so oh, ripe for that discussion that it's unavoidable. You shouldn't avoid it. You should just prepare.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think like there's
straight up, I
probably
don't know. Straight up disadvantages. I don't know. I don't know.
I would say just like a stream of like whatever they do, we do more, right? So if the other side
Yeah.
has an argument, like I kind of like the idea of if you can get away with like a plan plus situation that somehow avoids a permutation, right? Where like they'll take it as well. So if they are taking away mandatory minimums, like you take away all drug sentencing, right? Or something like that. Now, granted, that's kind of a case plus, like that's plan plus, so that's more permeable. I think there's going to be a lot of argument coming down in that area of like what is okay to perm, like how are those two things mutually exclusive? So proving mutual exclusivity in those areas, like you're not going to keep mandatory minimums but then also remove all criminal drug sentencing. So I think that would get a little bit tricky. I think maybe on the negative, if you can come to an even more significant position in the criminal justice system that is not policing or sentencing, but like come to a greater systemic issue that maybe like requires being tackled in another way, run that as a counter plan and use the same funding or whatever, like find different ways to make that mutually exclusive. So what are the biggest changes outside of policing and sentencing, or maybe
Uh,
even bigger than policing and
yeah.
sentencing?
I mean, I might build some competition for disbanding versus like defunding. That
Sure.
might be, you know what I mean? That like, maybe that's not criminal justice reform. You know what I mean? Like if you're completely disbanding it. So
Sure. I
uh,
think probably one of the biggest ones also is plea bargains. So that's one I don't know if that necessarily falls under. I guess you could argue that falls under sentencing, but plea bargains are used in upwards of 80% of cases, which is
yeah.
like statistically impossible, right? That like 80% of people that are brought in are all guilty. But
Mhm.
because the court system is so backed up, this was actually this is already an old topic. It was like 2005. We were debating about this. Court systems are so backed up that if there's any, reasonable chance, in the police's eyes, reasonable chance of guilt, it's going to be 6 months before you get a case or before you get a hearing, right? And what do you do for 6 months if you can't make bail? You're sitting in prison unjustly, like unfairly, just because you happen to be at the wrong place, the wrong time, right? So I think but because like you're in that position, so it's like crime if you do, crime if you don't. Like plea bargains tend to be like the lesser of the two evils, yet it then ascribes a criminal record, even if you're somehow able to plea yourself out of any time. Like what a horrible position to be in. So I think just my general strategy whenever going for topics like this is to look at the worst, right? Like who are the most affected? What's the worst stuff coming out of this? And I mean, that's where everyone else is probably thinking as well. But I think you're going to be able to tell the most impactful story in some of those areas. And that's where you end up crafting. I find the best case is who's the most impacted, what's the most significant piece of it. So I would say probably in the sentencing direction on this, but I think the negative could come up with something even bigger on that.
Yeah. I think there's seek out some people with some really good critical positions and really listen to them. I think that would
Sure.
be my strategy. All right. I think there's a lot of people out there that got some really good ideas on this, especially on the sort of on a critical neg. Yeah.
Yeah. I would honestly, if you're able to in any way get in touch with a civil rights attorney. I know that we talked last time about getting attorneys on the subject of immigration. Like that's a really knowledgeable resource. But this one, similar, like dealing with that justice system, there happen to be lots of attorneys out there that do this kind of thing. So if you can get the ear of a civil rights attorney, I think that you could probably learn a whole lot of stuff that is either harder to research or would take a ton of time for you to figure it out, but they're doing it all day, every day and can really consolidate that. So I think that would be a useful avenue to go as well.
All right. Hey, that's our time, everybody. Okay. We'll be back next week with another topic for you. Okay. All right. This is Tim Seavey, Visolutions and San Diego State University. I'm Jared Kabika Miller, your communications professor, debate coach. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.